Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter Swoboda, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change, which is part of the Making Good Men Great program and movement, hopefully, to look at each of us becoming better individuals and therefore creating a better community. Now, before I go anywhere, let me please encourage all of you who are listening to subscribe to the podcast, and I want to encourage you to leave a rating and a review, mainly because it'll help me to get some feedback of what sort of thinking's out there, and we may not all agree, but we can certainly have some good discussions, even though this is a bit of a one-way street most of the time. Now, I want to reach out to a listener, Brown Man 82, who wrote a review which really touched me. And he says, "Gunter's words are music to the soul, so wise and informative. Love this podcast." Brown Man 82, thank you very, very much. I read that with a certain level of humility, but also a certain level of joy, because not that I want to necessarily come across as being the fount of all wisdom, which I'm not. In fact, far from it. But I want to make us think, and I want to make us reflect on what's going to help to create a better self, a better family, a better community, and ultimately how we can leave this as a legacy, because we certainly do need it at a time of history that we're in. Things are not going all that well, folks, and I think we need to really look at getting in touch with the root of the problem. And as you know, in my podcast, fundamentally one of the most serious issues that we're grappling with is the issue of patriarchy and its effects on individuals, but not just men. And in that vein, I just recently ran across, I've got to be honest, my wife ran across it and she sent it to me, which was on TikTok. And I don't use TikTok. I don't know much about it. So it's sort of like, okay, another social media thing. There's all these plenty of platforms going. But here was one which really piqued my interest, because a lot of times on social media, what we see, and I'm going to be blunt, is pretty superficial, right? A lot of this stuff about influencers and so on is about, these happy lifestyles and, better physically, and sort of, this very superficial idea of what mental health is about. And yeah, I know I'm being critical, and some of you may sort of go, he's being really judgy. Well, I sort of am, because we need to sift through what's some decent knowledge and how we can apply that wisely. And, I do appreciate that sometimes we need to lighten up and get into something a bit frivolous. But, at the same time, when Rome's burning, I don't think looking at the wardrobe to see what better clothes you can wear is necessarily going to solve the problem. Anyway, enough of that rant. So let me talk about the TikTok guy. Now, he goes by the moniker of Comrade Cam. And he was very straight to the point. And this is one of the things that I love about Turning Points, okay? There is a zeitgeist emerging in the masculine community. Now, it's still quite polarised, and yes, I do get trolled about my opinions and my points of view, but by and large, the men are becoming much, much more educated and interested in understanding our socialisation and what really influences us. So Comrade Cam did a TikTok, and he went straight to the point to explain why men actually need feminism. Now, I've made it very clear in other podcasts that I'm not trying necessarily to turn men into feminists. I actually, what I'm trying to do, to which feminism is aligned, I want to go another level up, and that is I want us to become humanists. You know, yep, okay, it's my bias. I'm a humanistic existentialist. Fundamentally, if you want to put me in a bracket. But to me, it is all about being human, not necessarily just male or female or, you know, black or white or whatever it is, whatever, sort of dichotomy we want to sort of pitch ourselves into. So one of the things, so let me just go through a little bit to sort of give you a taste of what he was saying. And he says, feminism is beneficial for men. Now, all of you think feminism is hating men. Now, let me qualify that. I don't believe all of us men think feminism is about hating men. And he makes the point that it's not, and he's on point. What he's talking about is he says it's about taking down patriarchy and oppressive norms. Even though men are the ones who benefit from patriarchy the most, they are still victimised to an extent. Now, my argument is that, I'd take out the qualifier to an extent. Men fundamentally are victimised by patriarchy. Even if you're in the top 1 to 5% of those who influence, make policy, are wealthy enough, you're a trillionaire or a billionaire, and, you've got direct access to your representative politicians or even the ones that aren't, in some ways you are still locked and shackled into a social ideology that's toxic. Patriarchy is toxic. Now, he says you can think of it as misogyny being a two-way street. Patriarchy tells men they shouldn't be vulnerable or show emotions. Now, I understand that, I've just learned to understand that TikTok has a certain limit on what you can put into it. So let me expand that a little bit, because I think the perspective of simply looking at emotional expression is two-dimensional. It's not broad enough. It's not deep enough. There's more to it than that. Essentially, what patriarchy tells men is not just that they can't be vulnerable, but they need to not show vulnerability. They're not to be emotionally in touch, but they're also not to be empathic, right? And one of the things that patriarchy fundamentally, directly and indirectly creates is an atmosphere, a culture wherein men immediately acquire a narcissistic attitude and defense mechanism. Okay, so if you can't be vulnerable, you sure as hell need some good defense mechanisms to cope with what's going on in your community, in your culture, in your profession. Now, he makes a very, very good point when he sticks to the whole issue of emotions. And that is, he says, patriarchy, it uses misogyny to label those things as feminine things. Okay, so we've got this bipolar attitude being created and being maintained. And he says, so when men get vulnerable or emotional, they're criticised, made fun of, told to be a man, not to act like a woman, which is very, very, very true. But I want to include empathy in this. If you're too empathic, right, then that's a problem too, right? It's seen as feminist or it's being feminized. You know, one of the people that trolled me made the point is you're trying to, get men to lose their dicks and be pussies. And far from it. That's absolutely, totally not what I'm into. But what I'm trying to help men is to abandon the shackles of patriarchy and begin to live a significantly richer life, which means being more self-aware, being more in touch with your emotions, being more empathic, being able to be much, much more intimate in your relationships, and being able to really get on top of this whole thing about living a life wherein stewardship and collaboration or cooperation is the foundation, and not competition and not acquisition, and certainly not status. So quite rightly, Comrade Cam says, that's toxic as hell for men because men end up bottling up their emotions, which is true. Once we internalise emotions, we're really on a very, very slippery road, especially bottling up anger, which can very easily lead to a state of depression, wherein we feel helpless and hopeless, and we just feel completely disempowered. Now, when I'm talking about anger, I'm not talking about aggression, which unfortunately is one of the consequences of internalising anger, is that when we blow, we become aggressive, and at times it ends up in violence, rage and violence. So if I'm having an altercation with my 17-year-old because he's really getting under my skin, the next thing I want to do is I want to actually throttle him. And unfortunately, some of us lose it in that moment and reach out and, not throttle him, but certainly become very physical with that boy. Not a good state of affairs. So Comrade Cam has really clearly identified that patriarchy oppresses all of us, some more than others, but yes, all of us. So he comes to the conclusion, so men need to be a feminist also for their own sake. Now, let me bring this and let me just sort of examine it a little bit, because fundamentally, in some respects, he's right, because feminism is about, essentially equality. Right, and I made a podcast recently where I said, patriarchy versus democracy, or patriarchy and democracy, can't coexist very happily. It's an oxymoron. One is a egalitarian, principled way of conducting culture and relationships in a culture, and the other one is hierarchical, territorial, and fundamentally is based on competition. And that means there's always a winner and a loser. Democracy is not necessarily about that, although it has become that because of its relationship with patriarchy. It's also economically oppressive. Patriarchy and its, immoral handmaiden neoliberalism is economically oppressive. It's one of the reasons why women have struggled, in essence, to lead independent lives, because they were locked out of, the economic sphere to a large degree. If in the 70s, in the early 70s, if you were a female, you wanted a loan, you had to get your dad or your husband to go guarantor. Now, that's crazy, even if you had a job. You also, didn't get to vote until fairly late into history. If you were living in ancient Rome as a woman, you had very, very little power, unless you were like Livia in that program, Domina, who was capable of being very intelligent and used her intelligence to manipulate, the men around her to guide them into what she perceived that she wanted, not just for herself, but also for Rome. So, we have some fairly serious legacies. Now, interestingly enough, one news item that was that happened to be at the same time as me reading this thing with Comrade Cam was that one of the exclusive men's clubs in Australia, the Australia Club, had a vote about whether they should admit women. Now, this is, my cynical self, went, oh, okay, that's not going to happen when it was first floated. And sure enough, it didn't. They chose to keep women out of this very exclusive, very powerful collective of men. These people are politicians. I was about to say they were statesmen, but I actually don't think a lot of politicians are statesmen anymore. That takes a certain ethical, moral character, which many of them seem to lack. So no, they're not statesmen, they're politicians. And so it's a bit disturbing. Now, there was a couple of people, obviously, in the club who decided this is not okay, and one of them resigned. Now, there's a debate about whether he should have resigned or if he should have stayed in the club to try and influence the others to change their mind, and so that the vote, changes. I think that could be a really good idea. So, I've reached out to Comrade Cam, and if he happens to hear this podcast, I'd love to be in touch because I think it's, it's great to touch base with people who are like-minded, but we need to be also in touch with people who think we're on the wrong track, because we need to have a meaningful conversation about this, which is all about what making good men great ultimately boils down to, is that, idea of deconstructing patriarchy, because we can see its toxicity at work. But it's also for us as men to have a program that allows us to expand our experience of ourselves, our experience within relationships, and our experience in regard to the community at large. Our well-being is not simply based on economics. In fact, far from it. Most of our well-being is determined by the political and cultural ideologies that abound. And this is why I'm talking about we need to get rid of patriarchy, and we need to sort of kick neoliberalism out as well, because they're unhealthy. Since the manifestation of neoliberalism as a sort of social engineering artifact, communities have been suffering. It's the correlation between psychological distress and the increase in disorders and suicide has a very strong correlation with that whole ideology. Now, we obviously need to do some more research, but I know that, when you're working 3 jobs and you can barely feed yourself and pay the rent, that the economic model that you're operating in is not good for you. And at the same time, we're watching, billionaires' wealth grow exponentially. And there is no trickle-down effect. Okay, so they're my thoughts today. So, here's a turning point on a broader scale. We're starting to hear men talk about, getting rid of patriarchy and how bad it is. And this is an important turning point in my view. It needs a groundswell. Hopefully it'll turn into a tsunami and wash all the crap away that we've been lumbered with. Now, we've got to be careful with that, because we don't want to chuck the baby out with the bathwater either. So hopefully this is some food for thought. In the next episode, I've actually got another example of where, we're getting we're seeing a significant impact on a more local level in terms of what men are thinking and how they're responding to this particular point in history where we're looking at equality, especially between genders, but also the flow on onto the general community. So until next time, please, if you're a subscriber, write a review, let me know what you think. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. Again, it's not just about men. This is also about us as a community. And ultimately, what is it that we're going to do And what are we going to leave as a legacy for our children, our grandchildren? Ecologically, we're in a really sticky space, and we're dealing with, dinosaurs in decision-making places that seem to be completely devoid of an understanding of the critical nature that we find ourselves in. So, until next time, take care, be well, and make the most of what you got.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.